Hi everyone, and welcome to the What to Expect When Expecting Headless webinar with Amplience, Salesforce and Astound Commerce. The panel discussion will be moderated by Craig Smith, the Industry Director for Retail from Salesforce. And on the panel today, we have Tom Armstrong, the VP of Solutions for Amplience, Pete Ewell, the VP of Technology for Astound Commerce, and James Semple, the Senior Solutions Architect for Salesforce. This is Salesforce's forward-looking statement. You may have seen this before. We won't be covering this off now, but you will have access to it after the webinar. That's it from me. Craig, over to you.
Great, well, let's get stuck in. I'm going to start with Pete. So Pete, just for some clarity, what is headless and how does it differ from a more traditional e-commerce platform approach?
Yeah, so headless, I guess at its core, is an architecture strategy around delivering commerce. So it focuses on decoupling the components to provide the services that you need to sell through these digital channels. So bringing this to life, when we talk about these components, we're talking about things like CMS, search browse tools, promotion engines, personalization engines, basket, etc. When we talk about services, we're thinking about things like get me all of the products that are related to that category, or get me all of the content that's related to that brand. Now, with the headless approach, what you're looking to do is build the library of these services out and expose them over APIs. You get that right, you get this full library, this suite of capability. It basically means any front end or head can interact with those services in a consistent way. So how that differs from a classical e-com deployment where everything is in that one box, you have, for example, a CMS component that comes with that e-commerce platform. It's tightly coupled into the front end of what that e-commerce platform provides. It's a wonderful thing because a lot of people have worked really hard to make that one box do everything that in theory you need it to do. However, if, for example, your content management system isn't providing the right capability, it's a lot of work to modify that component in that one big box. Whereas with headless, splitting these things out, decoupling those things allows you to put best of breed in each area. And it also means all of those heads, all of your channels are all working with the same tool set, the same data, and are able to do the same things. So it's a big change of thinking from the classical approach of an e-com platform. But what we're starting to see is the advances in technology, certainly over recent years, has really started to allow this architecture to be a thing. Whereas a few years back, various technology limitations made it much, much harder to get to this level of flexibility.
Great, thank you very much for that, Pete. James, you've been working in this world for quite a while now, and there's a lot of myths and preconceptions, and probably a few blind spots in there. Could you give us a bit of kind of clarity here and around this, and what have you seen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing I would typically see as an area where I think people are coming at headless perhaps with the wrong approach would be they think it's cheaper and quicker to implement. And if that's really what you're aiming for, if it's down to just reducing costs or really trying to get to market quickly, I actually think there are different ways to approach it. And in fact, I would say if getting to market quickly is what you're looking at, then still a full stack solution is probably the right thing for you. I would also say that as a blind spot, I think what I'm seeing is that buyers will often underestimate just the investment they have to put in. I'm not talking about cost, I'm also talking about time and the operational and ownership aspects of this as well. So headless is not a point solution, it's not flicking a switch, it's not something straightforward like that. It is an architecture, often requires quite a rethink. And there's just this sense that if you don't really scope out how much you're doing initially, you're going to find that things become a lot bigger because you have to really take into account a big picture view on your architecture there and look at all of the operations and your processes and what you're now owning as well. From a, you have a sense of ownership of things that, as Pete rightly was saying, were previously inside the product. The other thing I would say, though, is that the true benefits of headless around more like the flexible aspects. And again, this is what Peter's been saying, you no longer have this one-to-one mapping from your front end to your back end. You have the ability to consume multiple back end systems into a seamless front end, but also you can group these together and expose them through multiple different front end channels. And I think the last point I would probably make is that there's a lot of focus initially on that initial build. Yet one of the big advantages of headless is the ability to actually change the system once it's up and running. So you can, update, expand, reconfigure the system. And this ongoing value is huge because it doesn't require those really onerous rebuilds that, again, Pete was talking about in his section. So as your user experience layer, for instance, it allows you to keep pace with the kind of ever-changing demands of your customers without having to re-architect your whole system. So that's where I see the big improvement there.
Great, thank you for that. And Tom, I hear this word headless CMS. That's another phrase to add into the melting pot. What does it mean? Well, what's the advantage of doing that?
Of course, and I think great introductions to the concepts by Peter and James. Headless CMS is a bit interesting, right? Because it's not necessarily correlated to headless commerce, right? So one of the nuances that you kind of learn as you step into the world of headless is that there's a lot of different ways to do it. So at Amplience, really what we're trying to do is just give our customers the freedom to do more. And most of the time, right, there's a bottleneck that's preventing folks from doing more, right? And it's more often than not, it's needing a developer to code out some content and deploy it to a site, right? Content is always sometimes an afterthought, right? In the world of commerce, and solutions like Amplience are going to help those folks unlock those bottlenecks. So what it means to be a headless CMS is that we can decouple that front end, as Peter was talking about, right? So we can model content externally as data and then use, right, lots of exciting ways to kind of pipe it back into the front end, be it a commerce-led Salesforce experience, be it a React application, whatever you like. And the overall goal, though, right, is to basically make people more agile. So you've got folks like Sweaty Betty, who's a joint customer, and it was just taking them way too long, right? It took about 2 weeks end to end to create new content. And obviously, right, in the age of COVID and lockdowns, digital bears the brunt of all of the promotional and the discovery. So they've been able to implement a headless CMS on Salesforce and reduce that to days, right? So they're getting stuff out much faster. The other piece, right, beyond just solving that developer problem is now if I'm storing something in a headless CMS, I've got the ability to push it into different experiences. So we have customers that are using things like Salesforce Marketing Cloud and managing now the emails they create and pushing them to there, or even native applications, and even IoT with folks like Traeger. So it's certainly a part of an overall solution for headless, but it doesn't necessarily have to be headless itself, if that makes sense. Great, that does make sense. Thank you, Tom. And James, you've been involved in a lot of the kind of implementations of headless commerce over the years. And what business results? We kind of talk a lot about the kind of the technical terms, etc. But what are the kind of business results you've actually seen in people who've actually gone and pioneered this stuff? Yeah, well, obviously this can be companies do try and keep some of that under wraps, but I can certainly go and say that, for instance, Under Armour, they moved to a headless progressive web app, and they did an A/B test with their traditional storefronts. So they literally ran them in parallel, A/B tested them against them. And what they saw was that headless progressive web app storefront actually had an increase in conversion rate of 76%. Sorry, my numbers there. Yeah, 76% increase in conversion rate and a drop of 38% in the bounce rate. So really, really improved their customer engagement because of that new UX layer there, and that was done in a headless environment. A second example I could give would be a multi-billion-dollar UK department store. They had a very traditional, tightly coupled stack, and they moved to a headless stack with a decoupled storefront. And a big reason for that was similar to what Tom's just been saying. Really, their deployments were very slow. Their ability to change things in line with what the customers are expecting, stuff like that, that was very, very slow. They managed to increase their number of deployments to 8 times as many deployments per year. And this allowed them to test, learn, and deploy faster to, in turn, boost revenue faster. This allows them to be a lot more flexible and change to the market demands. It also allowed them to, not have to do code freezes through peak trading and so on. And really, the last aspect I really want to focus on here is that this is a very, very large business, as you can imagine. They were able to take a very, very large architecture and go on a multi-year transformational project. And by going in a headless way, they're actually able to capitalize on the ROI very early on in that multi-year deal by focusing on that user experience up front as part of that transformation. So I think if there's a lot of people listening in who are in this kind of full stack situation and want to go headless, I think that's kind of an important aspect towards it. Great, thank you. And Tom, when I'm thinking headless CMS,
you have some fabulous looking websites that use Amplience Headless CMS, but they're using more traditional kind of integrated storefronts like Salesforce Commerce, our standard kind of Salesforce reference architecture. So what is that? That's a way to do it, right? You don't have to go full on build everything from a set of kind of services. You could still integrate your kind of your platform with a traditional platform with a headless CMS and get great results.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what I was saying up front, right? It's like headless is an overarching approach, right? But headless CMS is going to solve multiple front ends, right? So, you know, obviously headless commerce is the topic du jour, but at the end of the day, with Salesforce right now, we do a ton of work with folks that are just still, you know, running on Salesforce reference architecture or even old site Genesis, right? It's really, it goes back to what I was saying before. It's folks are trying to solve a problem that it's too hard to create. They have a lot of content velocity, and they don't want to rely on either developers to get into that, or like James was saying, right? Maybe they want to separate the marketing development stream from the merchandising stream, right? So if you have a very content heavy branded manufacturer that's got a lot of, you know, recipes like Traeger or blog posts and edits like Liberty, they're trying to solve that problem. And, you know, it still relies on Salesforce from a front end perspective because it's extremely performant, you know, global scale, all the great stuff about it. So it's really, at the end of the day, when folks are going down this route, they're trying to unlock something they couldn't do. It's either they want to do more testing and optimization. That was really what was driving the folks at Crate. They want to create more editorial content like Liberty, or in Traeger's case, right, they just want to get content into their grill devices, their apps, and everything else, right? So it's one of those things that you don't have to go headless for the headless CMS, right? It's really up to the outcomes you're trying to achieve from a business perspective.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah, cool.
And Pete, just building on that, so you've been building headless commerce sites for some of your Salesforce commerce customers. I guess you must have some stories from the front line. What can you tell us some of those stories you got from the front line and where you've been doing headless projects on Commerce Cloud?
Yeah, so I mean, we're seeing lots of different things. I think Tom's point actually sums it up quite nicely, which is there's quite a lot of confusion around, you know, what headless is, what it means, what the flavor of headless is that people need. And I guess the answer is actually there isn't like a one size fits all anymore, which is a great thing. But therefore, it's easy to understand where the confusion comes from, because for so many years, people have lived in, you buy an e-commerce box, you deploy an e-commerce box and you customize it and modify it and plug in some external components as you go. Actually, now this new way of thinking takes quite a bit for people to get their head around. So what we're finding at Astound is we're spending a lot of time helping people. We're spending a lot of time advising and guiding people on what matters to them, and therefore what the technology needs to be to, you know, to achieve those goals. And what's interesting about headless is we see quite a lot of requests for headless coming purely from the technical team within the business, because to them it makes perfect sense that this microservices based approach, everything neatly decoupled, back-end services, front-end architecture, it does make perfect sense. Marrying that, however, to what the business needs and what the business goals are and how they achieve that is the other part of the puzzle which we're helping to solve. So what we're finding is, as we're going through this journey with some existing customers who are looking to move in this direction, as James said, planning, understanding, guiding, consulting to say what a headless stack can look like for them, the different flavors of it and the various benefits that could bring, coupled with how we address some of the other technical challenges on what is essentially still a fairly new kind of approach to everything. And things are still kind of coming out of the woodwork as we go, but we're definitely seeing the benefits of when it's done right and it's married to a company well, how strong it can be in terms of providing results and supporting the business versus the more classical kind of e-com approach.
Great, thank you for that. And one of the other topics that we're hearing a lot of right now, especially in Salesforce, is essentially real-time interaction. So understanding what the customer is doing right now, pairing that with what I might know about them previously, and then getting the right content in front of the customer. So real-time personalization. To deliver this experience, headless CMS is quite advantageous, isn't it, Tom?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the holy grail that a lot of customers are trying to achieve, right? Personalization at scale, right? And I think, you know, solutions like Salesforce are really stepping up and kind of retooling what they can do to kind of deliver automated personalization. So if you think about anything automated from a personalization perspective, it's going to need machine learning, right? And machine learning needs data. And historically, that's always been great when you have things like product catalogs that are extremely defined, have tons of metadata, lots of attribution. Now, content, it's typically stored as presentation in a lot of systems, right? So that means it's stored as HTML, and you get one big, blob of content back. And the personalization engines themselves don't really know a lot, how to do with it, right? You could do things like natural language processing, but there's typically so much, junk, like, CSS and JavaScript and tags in there that it's not going to work. So first and foremost, right, having Headless CMS, you're storing it as data, right? That's the whole decoupled approach, right? I think Pete talked about that in the beginning. So we're going to have that content be as data and be able to feed that into a machine learning approach, right? And we're starting to see that emerge with some exciting projects that we're working on right now. We're also taking a step to go, a little bit further at Amplience, where we're not just saying, great, here's your attributes for text-based data, or your, blog articles can now be easier to read by a machine, but we're applying taxonomies and classification to content as well. So you're also applying some smarts, right? You get into exciting, nerdy topics like ontologies and things of that nature that the machines themselves need to be able to create those personalized recommendations. And then finally, right, it's speed. Everything that you want to do in today's world, you don't want that old school flickering approach when you land on a website and it's going out and calling something and loading it client side. You want these things to be talking, server side, API first. And so I think from our perspective, right, that's why we've been working to create these, 30 millisecond response times, so people don't have to worry about when it all connects together, the consumer, it's going to be completely seamless and lightning fast. I'm sure that's a great one for James, because that's obviously what the world of PWAs have been forever, right?
Can you just define, James, because you used that term earlier as well, PWA? There's a lot of more like Headless CMS is another term. What does a PWA mean? What does it give the business?
Yeah, no, great question. So the really, really quick answer is it's kind of halfway between a native app and a website. It is still a website, but it has sort of native app-like functionality. Initially developed really to run just on mobile devices, now runs across on desktop as well. The benefits that I've seen to a retailer is that your customers have a very, very engaging experience. Typically, without going into the technical aspects of it, the way it works, slightly different from a traditional website, means that it's faster from page to page just faster throughout the site in general. Also, it has the ability to cache a lot of data locally, which means it's resilient if you're under low network conditions. All in all, it just functions a lot more like an app, and that means your customers feel a lot more secure when using it. They don't think it's going to drop off halfway through a transaction and so on. And again, it just leads to increased levels of customer engagement, whether that means more traffic, more pages viewed, more purchases, higher transaction rates, and so on.
Great, thank you. And what we're going to do now is just move into some of the more operational points. So the practicalities of kind of once you've got your headless site, kind of, what's the day-to-day reality? And Pete, a question for you here around if you're in a commercial focus role or you're accountable for for trading online and the revenue, what are the operational advantages of a headless platform?
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because you've got advantages in the capability that you have, and in putting in headless, you've had that ability to put in the best of breed in all of these areas. So your teams are using the tooling, which really empowers them to merchandise the site, to add content, to tune the personalization, all of that kind of good stuff that these dedicated tools can bring. The downside of that, of course, is operationally, you now need to manage multiple tools that are connected and are talking to each other. So whereas before, your tool set was mostly focused around your ecom platform that had everything within it, and your training and your teams were focused on that. Now, by its very nature, headless means that you've got multiple systems to log into and to manage this content. Now, again, I think this falls back to some of the other things and some of the tracks that we've been covering here, which is headless done right is wonderful, headless done badly is catastrophic. So as you're going through that kind of understanding of if it's right for you, a small team cannot manage 4 different components and 4 different boxes. It's not reality. Whereas actually the larger teams that can focus and work with this stuff are therefore going to be much more empowered to do a lot more. So operationally, it is not a smoother operation than using the kind of classical one box approach. But from a results, from a potential, from a flexibility perspective, you're kind of much more empowered in those areas to do more with the tools you have. And I think, as Tom mentioned, you've got more power to chop and change some of those boxes and some of those tooling as you grow and you evolve and want to add new components. You're set up to do that. So yeah, it's that one size doesn't fit all, but in that case, operationally more than anything else, there's a significant risk that if a small business overstretched with what they were doing from a headless space, they could actually find themselves really, really struggling to kind of keep up and manage the overall kind of platform.
Great, thank you for that. And James, on a ongoing cost of ownership, what is the I guess the implication here? I mean, in overall cost of ownership, because there's obviously there's a narrative that we talked about earlier around, well, it's cheaper to do it this way. What's the reality there around operating a headless website, around impact on cost of ownership?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think while I said earlier on that, if cost just I want it cheaper isn't necessarily the right way to go. However, you could be a lot more flexible and have more control of the various levers that do control the costs. So there is that aspect to it. Flexibility is definitely the key here. But if you want to control it right from day one and you want to map this out, then you have to map out what your entire headless solution is. One aspect of that is with headless, I guess one of the things is being very aware of what your existing full stack solution is doing. If you're moving from a typical full stack solution to a headless environment, you really have to kind of go through and catalog everything it's doing and not just assume that, oh, I'm getting this and this, that should do what I've got already, because that is an area where you can really run into costs. So a good example of that straight away, for instance, and I've seen this get to the 11th hour inside a sales cycle, and suddenly people ask these questions. What about hosting? Who is actually hosting that front end of your site? Because if you've got a large business, you've got an enterprise grade kind of business here, just the public cloud hosting fees for the front end alone can, run into kind of, six-figure costs annually. So these can be like not insignificant. So I think just one of the things is go down there, catalog all the various aspects of this. We brought up some of the comments already. Obviously content, but personalization came up, search came up, and so on. Make sure you have got all those components that you need, and then start to map out what those costs are. Because until you've done that, I think I've seen people make assumptions and then suddenly be vastly, inaccurate in terms of those assumptions, and suddenly, they're finding the costs run way higher. So try and go into it. And I think part of this webinar today is about that, right? What are the right questions to ask going in, and go in with your eyes open and make sure you have mapped out every part of what your current website you're replacing is doing.
Great, thank you. And Tom, what about on a marketing level? So with a headless CMS, do you have to think and work differently when you've got a headless CMS as a marketer?
Oh, definitely, right. And I think one of the things that we try to do when we engage with any prospective client is to make sure they realize that, headless is going to solve a specific problem, but it's also going to change the way you need to work, right? So make sure they understand, headless is a technology approach that needs to be, adapted with process and people change as well. And right, things like change management, right? There's part of any kind of major, sea change that occurs in the technology world, just like when people went from on-prem to cloud, right? It people's cheese gets moved, right? To use the rote business term. And I think, what Peter said was great, right? Like you got these best of breed headless approaches and everyone's got their own, tool set to maybe do their job, but who's looking at it from an overall perspective? And, we like to get people in the kind of jobs to be done framework, if you will, right? How are we going to achieve what we need to achieve here from a marketing perspective? And that's holistic between content, promotions, personalization, search, right? It all needs to kind of sing together. One of the things that I love, I always love when our customers tell us, in their own language instead of the marketing speak that we do. And one of my clients from Tapestry, I think, said it really well. It's like, we need to move from a finished goods mindset to semi-finished, right? So I love that it ties into a manufacturer's world, right? You're not having, images passed in from the creative team that are burned in with all of the promotional content and text in them. And you're not handing things over to a developer to give HTML, right? You've got to now start to be comfortable with breaking things down into components, right? So having content types that can stack up to create really compelling like homepage experiences, but you have to start by breaking it down. And that mindset requires buy-in from everyone from creative, right? So There's a lot of great tools out there that people are using, things like Figma and Sketch that kind of break UX into components. The developers need to be involved because you're ultimately going to be creating, rendering templates and experiences that are going to be able to take these bits and pieces and create the whole. And then the producers, right, they've got to start becoming a little bit more comfortable with assembly, right? So the term composable is also very popular these days, and that's really what you're doing. You're breaking down a production cycle into its components and building it back up again. So if people can embrace that, they realize that all of a sudden they don't need to get 4 people involved to get their job done. They can do it all themselves, but there's a learning curve, there's fear, and there's got to be buy-in, from the top down.
So it sounds like better speed and creativity as a result.
Oh yeah, 100%. But it can't happen overnight, right? People want their drag and drop stuff back when you go into headless, and you kind of have to understand the benefits of going headless is the flexibility, but it also comes with a little bit of a cost, right?
Great, thank you. And we're going to move on to the final subject, which is just around the actual project, because I guess a lot of our audience will be pretty interested in what does the project look like, because this is I guess we're breaking new ground here, and some of this stuff is reasonably uncharted territory. So I'm going to start with James. Just questions on examples of, I guess, red flags, things to look out for. What indicators are there that headless project isn't going to go well? Is there early indicators that suggest maybe this wasn't the right thing to do? Yeah. So how should we think about doing a headless project?
Yeah, I noticed there's some good comments earlier on about when it goes well, it's great. When it's bad, it's atrocious. If I'm selling to Americans, I'll often say it's a bit like moving from automatic to stick shift. It's like there's more to keep, better drivers would like to do that, but there's more to take care of. Actually, I think that the red flags come up pretty early. So for the last 3 years or so, I've been speaking to retailers very much in a consultative manner. And the way I do that is to identify the key requirements up front. And I understand with them, how headless can achieve what they want, because headless is really a how as opposed to a why or a what in that sense. And I will constantly sort of map back to actual, business value, really, business drivers and business goals. So why do you want to go headless? Are you expecting this to improve, for instance, revenue, customer engagement, site performance, operational efficiency? Perhaps your existing system doesn't allow you to do something, so you can unlock new functionality that you didn't have. But clearly just understand a series of definable and measurable goals to understand why you're going headless. The old joke we used to use is, the CEO's golfing partner's site's gone headless. And so that's why I went, that is not a measurable way of going headless. And that cannot measure success if that's just the reason you're doing it for sort of a vanity project. So to go back to your point, really, the red flags would be any kind of vague or even undefined goals. If you're just thinking we'll go headless and then see what the result is, that is not a really good way of kind of leading to great success. Insufficient depth or rigor in understanding the full requirements, to go back to my previous point. If you haven't really understood everything you're doing right now, and you understand all of the benefits of your current software, suddenly you might find this unexpected gap. You don't want to start filling those in the last minute in the projects. And again, all of these kind of lack of rigor done up front lead to extended deadlines, increased budgets, all of these things like that start to put pressure on the project. I guess the last thing I would say about that is unrealistic expectations in the first place. So one of the worst things for me to go in is you start to have this conversation, you think everything's pretty open, but then, I get to my biggest competitor, which is the 3-month internal fantasy project, because the CTO says, well, I talked to my team, they reckon they can do it pretty quickly and they can get, and it's like, oh dear, because unfortunately, typically, no offense to any of these people, they just probably haven't gone through that rigorous thing. And as a result, they've just done a happy path. And I was a developer, I've done this myself. I know that you do like a happy path, I could probably get this knocked out pretty quickly. And you just don't take into account all the other things. And the problem is you've set the expectation in the mind of the buyer that it's going to be quick and it's going to be super cheap and so on. And so what we have to do then is go through an exercise where, as long as everyone is willing, we lay that out in front of it and explain all of the things that have to be done. And then everyone understands the cost and ramifications. So as long as they do that, then we can reset expectations and then we can go ahead. But that's usually my big flags. If people don't understand up front, that's the big thing.
Great, thanks for that. And Pete, I guess you're involved in implementations. You're living and breathing as an integrator. So just thinking about like an e-commerce website initially, I mean, how much more effort is it to build a headless website versus a more integrated e-commerce platform approach?
So it's definitely more complex. I completely resonate with a lot of what James has said. Many of those conversations I've been involved with as well. Various kind of scars and wounds from following conversations as well. But it is more complex because it has to be. By its very nature, it's more complex. There's more planning, there's more integrations. Integrations are always one of the more complex parts of any e-com delivery anyway. There's more data to think about. There's consistency between data between different systems to think about. What I would say is, of all of the retailers we work with, the ones that are constantly innovating and constantly releasing, regardless of headless versus e-commerce platform, regardless of approach, the ones that are doing that are the ones that have their data right and they have their integrations right. So headless kind of drives that more, as standard. So having that as a standard, which means you're able to integrate more, you're able to move data around, you're able to interpret it by different systems in different ways. That in its, on its own unlocks agility and flexibility in what you're doing on the front end, regardless of if it's a fully decoupled architecture or not. So what we're finding is, if the result of headless is actually people's awareness that they need to invest in really understanding what data they got, what tools are they using, how are they using them, that sets us up better to deliver what is a more powerful solution. Doesn't mean it's easier, doesn't mean it's cheaper. Where we are seeing innovation is more around, as these tools kind of improve, as headless becomes more of a standard and people want to get there, naturally the tooling, the processes start evolving to support that. So as Astound, we've been investing a lot for the last year now in how do we deliver headless? What components do we need to pre-build? What challenges do we find? Because something as simple as before, a payment gateway integration, you'd install the cartridge and that had everything that you needed for that payment integration. Now that works in the back end, but it means we get nothing on the front end. So we need to rebuild those templates that we took for granted in the more classical approach. There's now more work to get that working. So, but in doing that, there are now components that are pre-built on the front end to support that payment gateway integration, and you get the benefits of the performance and the the PWA side. Things like Mobify, those sorts of platforms didn't exist a few years back. So if you wanted to go headless and you needed your own front end, you were building it from the ground up, and it was an in-house project that inevitably came with the problems of having a proprietary bit of software in your retail organization. Whereas now Mobify is there to take care of all of that complexity. So again, we're it's speeding the process up. So whilst of course it's more expensive, it's more to think about, it's more complex, things are evolving, things are improving all of the time to make it easier, to make it more of a kind of norm, to the point where it's coming down in terms of complexity, certainly in some areas. And I think as Tom said, CMS is the way that we get the best out of a CMS in any implementation, is to work with it in a headless way, regardless of what's going on over here. So we can leverage a huge amount of benefit from just working in that way with that platform than in the kind of older way of kind of tightly pushing it in. So a very politician's answer, but it isn't a silver bullet. It doesn't solve all problems in just by going headless, but it encourages the right best practice. And exactly as James said, if people are on board with it and understand and are clear on the benefits of where it will take us all, then you're starting in the right way to achieve a really kind of impressive setup at the end.
And James, I guess with Mobify now being part of the Salesforce stack, is that one of the main reasons, is to help accelerate customers get towards kind of like PWA and headless storefront approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not taking away from the existing full stack offering. It really is just expanding the breadth of those offerings. And again, obviously working alongside our existing partners, both implementation partners and technical partners. So yeah, the idea is to really open that up a bit more, to make it more easy to integrate with Headless CMS and so on into a wider architecture like that. So the other aspect, I guess I would say, is that it's also to take care of some of those operational efficiencies by providing the hosting for that front end.
Great, thank you. So just to wrap up, I think you've all said with great power comes great responsibility. So what's your closing bit of advice for those considering headless? I'm going to start with Tom.
Great. Yeah. I mean, first of all, great discussion all around. Love the points. I mean, for James, I feel like you would appreciate this. Yesterday, I won't name names, but we got an RFP that basically just was a paragraph that said, or a sentence, I want a PWA, right? It's like, you know, and that's kind of what I'm getting at with this great power, great responsibility, right? You don't have to do everything at once, right? Maybe it's controversial to say because, you know, we want to be a part of like projects that are full on headless and all this other great stuff. But at the end of the day, the beauty of this approach, that hopefully one of the takeaways of today, is that you can define some results that you want and achieve that because you're breaking it down into smaller problems and smaller components. So, you know, work with folks in the ecosystem, work with vendors, SIs that know headless and know the approach, and have some projects under their belt, and build out that phased approach to mitigate the risk, right? It's really on you as the retailer of where you're going to see value the most and how can you apply that type of approach. You know, don't, it's again a rote phrase, but don't try to boil the ocean, try to solve the problems that are most pressing.
Great, so that's a nice segue to Pete, an integrator that knows how to do headless. So what's your closing bit of advice?
I really think about it from the business side, like really understand what you need. We mentioned a few very clear benefits of headless in discussion. Agree, there's some great points by everyone. The performance of the front end, what you can achieve from a content perspective, how it opens other channels up and allows you to roll through and you know, expose more from a customer experience side. But like quantify that, because if that's not important, then don't spend heaps of time and heaps of cash getting to the point of that headless solution when you just don't need it. There's so many different flavors of headless. The e-com platform is not the old hat thing that no one should go with. It's still very much a key way of delivering commerce, and it works for countless organizations and will continue to do so in the future. But only when you as a business are really aware of what you need to do can you then look at the technology strategy to support that. Don't let a technology strategy drive a decision which fundamentally impacts the entire business.
Great. And then finally, I guess, James, your closing remark.
Well, I mean, firstly, I think Tom and Pete's answers were fantastic, so it's very difficult to add that much more. So I agree with all of their points as well, but I guess I'll just add one other thing, which is one thing that surprised me, and obviously some of our customers, was look at the long-term business plan, because it's not about just getting it right straight out of the door. And I know this is a bit like what Tom was already saying, but even if you've gone full headless, that isn't the end game. That's just the starting point, because we talk about things like quite academic terms like agility and so on up front, but I've seen customers who've gone live, then thought, oh, it's not quite the right shape, but amazed in the next 6 months, we managed to roll out all these things. And it's like, that's what the headless agility is all about, is exactly that. You are now in a position to start looking at that and see it is the long-term business plan. It is the ongoing operational and flexible benefits in that sense. And ultimately, headless is about flexibility. And that's the way to look at it, I think.
Thank you. Well, I think we've benefited from the wisdom of some of the experts, the global experts on headless here. So I hope you all appreciated the discussion. We did recognise that to do this topic justice, we ought to have another session where we talk architecture and engineering. And so we're going to have a second webinar, which might not be for everybody who's attended this webinar. Maybe bring your architect, your VP of engineering, and your product management team along to talk about the architectural options. So we'll try and get this same group back together, reform the band for a second session in a few weeks' time. But thank you very much, guys, for your input. That was a fantastic discussion, and hopefully our audience got plenty from that. So thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. Thank you.